In Scotland, there is a lake so deep and so dark that nobody has ever reached the bottom, and the locals say something has been living in it for 1,500 years. Welcome to Local Legends. Today I am going to tell you what happened. The water is black, not dark blue, not shadow, grey, black. The kind of black that swallows light whole and gives nothing back. The surface of Loch Ness lies flat as hammered steel on windless mornings, stretching 23 miles southwest from River Ness, cutting through the Great Glen like a surgical incision through the Scottish Highlands. The loch is narrow, never more than 1.5 miles across, but it plunges 755 feet at its deepest charted point. Though some say the true bottom has never been mapped, the water holds more volume than all the lakes in England and Wales combined. It is cold year, round, fed by mountain streams that carry peat and silt. Particles so fine, they hang suspended in the water column, turning visibility to near zero below 30 feet. On certain autumn afternoons, when mist rolls down from the hills and settles on the surface, the loch becomes indistinguishable from the sky, a void between shores, and the only sound is the lap of small waves against stone, and the distant cry of a red kite circling overhead. This is a place that keeps secrets. The cold preserves them, the depth hides them, and the darkness, the absolute light swallowing darkness below the first few meters, ensures they stay hidden. This is the home of the Loch Ness Monster. The people who live along these shores today are descendants of Picts, Gaels, and Norse settlers, inheritors of a landscape shaped by ice and fire and millennia of human memory. The Great Glen itself is a geological scar, a rift valley formed by the Great Glen Fault, a tear in the Earth's crust that runs diagonally across the highlands from southwest to northeast. Loch Ness sits within this ancient wound. The land here is old in a way that resists easy comprehension. Old enough that its bedrock predates most complex life on Earth. Old enough that its valleys were carved and recarved by glaciers that advanced and retreated over hundreds of thousands of years. The most recent ice age ended roughly 12,000 years ago, and as the glaciers withdrew, they left behind this deep, cold trench filled with meltwater. The loch has been here, in more or less its current form, since the last ice retreated. So have the people, or their ancestors. By the time the Romans arrived in the 1st century AD, the region was inhabited by the Picts, a confederation of Celtic-speaking tribes, whose name comes from the Latin picti, meaning painted people, a reference to their practice of body decoration or tattooing. The Picts left behind standing stones, carved symbol stones, and a reputation among Roman historians as fierce and unconquerable. They were never fully subdued by Rome. After the Roman withdrawal from Britain, the Picts remained the dominant power in what is now northern and eastern Scotland until the 9th century, when they were gradually absorbed into the expanding kingdom of the Gaels, forming the nucleus of medieval Scotland. The Picts did not leave extensive written records. Most of what we know about them comes from external sources, from Irish annals and Northumbrian chronicles, but they left stories. Stories carved in stone, stories passed down through generations, stories about the land and the creatures that inhabited it. The waters of the Great Glen, and Loch Ness in particular, have long been understood as more than mere geography. In the cosmology of the early medieval Gaelic, speaking inhabitants of the Highlands, the natural world was densely populated with otherworld beings. Lochs, rivers, wells, and springs were especially significant. Liminal spaces where the boundary between the mortal world and the S-faith, the other world pronounced she, grew thin. Water spirits, shape, shifters, and kelpies, malevolent water horses that lured travelers to their deaths, featured prominently in the folklore. Some of these beings were protective, guardians of specific places. Others were dangerous, unpredictable, entities to be respected and avoided. The loch itself was not merely a body of water. It was an entity, a presence, something that could give and take life. Fishermen made offerings before setting out. Travelers avoided certain shores after dark. There were places along the water where you did not camp, where you did not linger, because the old ones said those places belonged to something else. By the 6th and 7th centuries AD, Christianity had begun to spread through the highlands, brought by missionaries from Ireland. The most famous of these was Saint Columba, the Irish abbot who founded the monastery on the island of Iona in 563 AD, and spent the next 3 decades evangelizing among the Picts. It is in the Vita Columbae, the Life of Columba, a hagiography written around 697 AD by Adam Fenn, the 9th abbot of Iona, that we find the earliest written reference to a creature in the waters of the River Ness, which flows out of the northern end of Loch Ness. The text describes an incident that occurred during Columba's travels through Pictish territory, likely sometime in the 560s. According to Adam Fane, Columba and his companions arrived at the River Ness and found a group of Picts burying a man who had been attacked and killed by a water beasts while swimming. Columba instructed one of his followers, a man named Luin Moku Min, to swim across the river to retrieve a boat from the far shore. When Luin entered the water, the creature surfaced and rushed toward him. With a great roar and open mouth, Columba raised his hand, invoked the name of God, and commanded the beast to go no further, and to touch not the man. The creature, we are told, fled in terror, and Luin completed his task unharmed. This account is often cited as the first recorded sighting of the Loch Ness Monster, though it is worth noting several details. First, the incident took place in the River Ness, not the loch itself, though the river is directly connected to the loch and flows from it. Second, Adam Fane's text was written more than a century after the event and is explicitly hagiographic. Its purpose is to demonstrate Columba's sanctity and miraculous power, not to provide a naturalistic description of wildlife. Third, the creature is described in terms consistent with other water beasts in early medieval Christian literature, which often depicted rivers and lakes as inhabited by demonic or monstrous entities that saints could subdue through faith. Nevertheless, the story establishes something important: the idea that the waters of the Great Glen, and Loch Ness specifically, were home to something large, aggressive, and ancient. Whether Adam Fane was recording a genuine encounter with an unknown animal, embellishing a local folktale for theological purposes, or both, the text makes clear that by the late 7th century, the notion of a dangerous creature in these waters was already part of the region's narrative landscape. For more than a millennium after Adam Fane, references to creatures in Loch Ness remain scarce and fragmentary. There are passing mentions in Gaelic folklore, stories of waterhorses and each, Wisjay, a particularly malevolent type of waterhorse that was said to inhabit lochs and sea inlets. But these were part of a broader tradition of water spirit lore that extended across Scotland and Ireland, not specific to Loch Ness. The loch was known. Certainly, it was fished, it was travelled, and it was feared in the way that all deep, cold, unpredictable bodies of water are feared by people who depend on them for survival. But it did not have a singular named monster associated with it in the popular imagination. That would change in the 20th century, and it would change suddenly, dramatically, and in a way that would transform Loch Ness from a remote highland waterway into one of the most famous and scrutinized bodies of water on Earth. The modern story of the Loch Ness Monster begins on May 2, 1933. On that date, the Inverness Courier, a local newspaper, published an article titled "Strange Spectacle on Loch Ness." The article reported a sighting by a Mrs. Aldi Mackay, the proprietor of the Drumnadrochit Hotel, which sits on the loch's western shore. According to the account, Mrs. Mackay and her husband had been driving along the newly completed A82 road, a route that runs along the loch's northern shore and had only recently been widened and upgraded. opening up previously inaccessible views of the water. When they witnessed something extraordinary, Mrs. Mackay described seeing an enormous animal rolling and plunging on the surface of the loch. The creature, she said, created considerable disturbance in the water and appeared to have a body that rose and fell in undulating humps. The sighting lasted several minutes before the creature submerged and disappeared. The article might have been a brief curiosity, a single-day story, except for two factors. First, the completion of the A82 road meant that more people than ever before had clear, unobstructed views of the loch. Previously, much of the shoreline had been accessible only by boat or rough footpath, and the dense forests and steep terrain limited vantage points. The new road changed that. It brought tourists, it brought traffic, and it brought witnesses. Second, the article used a specific phrase to describe what Mrs. Mackay had seen: the Loch Ness Monster. It is unclear whether this wording originated with Mrs. Mackay, with the journalist who wrote the piece, a man named Alex Campbell, who was also the water bailiff for the loch, and would go on to report his own sightings, or with an editor looking for a compelling headline. But the name stuck. By the end of May 1933, newspapers across Scotland were running stories about the monster, and by summer, the story had gone international. What followed was a media frenzy unlike anything the Highlands had seen before. Sightings multiplied. Some were undoubtedly sincere. People who saw something in the water they could not explain, perhaps a large fish, a floating log, a wave pattern, or an optical illusion, and who interpreted it through the lens of the growing legend. Others were almost certainly exaggerations or hoaxes, driven by the attention, and in some cases, the money that could be made from a good monster story. Newspapers sent reporters and photographers to the loch. In December 1933, the Daily Mail hired a big game hunter named Marmaduke Wetherell to investigate. Wetherell claimed to have found large footprints on the shore near Foyers. On the southeastern shore of the loch, plaster casts were made, photographs were taken, and the story was reported with breathless excitement. Within weeks, however, zoologists at the Natural History Museum in London examined the casts and determined that they had been made with a stuffed hippopotamus foot, likely an umbrella stand or ashtray base. Wetherell had been duped, or had perpetrated the hoax himself. The Daily Mail retracted the story, and Wetherell left the loch in disgrace. But the sightings continued. Throughout 1933 and into 1934, most descriptions shared certain features. The creature was large, at least 20 to 30 feet in total length. It had a long serpentine neck and a small head. Its body appeared to move in vertical undulations, rising and falling in a series of humps. And it was dark in color, usually described as gray, black, or dark brown. Some witnesses reported seeing flippers or paddles. A few claimed to have seen it on land, lumbering across the shore or the road near the water. These land sightings added a new dimension to the legend. This was not merely a fish or a sea serpent, but something amphibious, something capable of leaving the water. Then came the photograph. On the 19th of April 1934, the Daily Mail published what would become the single most famous image associated with the Loch Ness Monster, the so-called surgeon's photo. The image, taken by a London gynecologist named Robert Kenneth Wilson, showed what appeared to be a long, slender neck rising from the water, topped by a small, rounded head. The photograph was grainy, taken from a distance, and the creature, if that is what it was, occupied only a small portion of the frame. But it was compelling. It looked exactly like what people had been describing. A plesiosaur, a marine reptile from the age of dinosaurs, somehow surviving in the cold, deep waters of a Scottish loch. The image was reproduced in newspapers and magazines around the world. It became the defining visual representation of the Loch Ness Monster, the iconic image that would appear in encyclopedias, documentaries, and tourist brochures for the next 6 decades. Wilson himself was curiously modest about the photograph. He provided few details about the circumstances under which it was taken and declined to capitalize on its fame, refusing offers to sell the rights or to appear in promotional materials. For many, His reticence lent credibility to the image. Here was a respectable medical professional, not a publicity seeker, who had captured something extraordinary and then stepped back from the spotlight. The photograph was widely accepted as genuine, or at least as an honest attempt to document something Wilson believed he had seen. It was a lie. In 1994, 60 years after the photograph's publication, a man named Christian Sperling confessed on his deathbed that the surgeon's photo was a hoax. Sperling, a sculptor and model maker, revealed that he had constructed the monster from a toy submarine fitted with a sculpted head and neck made of plastic wood. The model was small. The neck stood only about 12 to 15 inches above the water and was photographed in shallow water near the shore to create the illusion of distance and scale. The hoax had been orchestrated by Marmaduke Wetherell, the same big game hunter who had been humiliated by the hippopotamus foot incident the previous year. Wetherell, seeking revenge against the Daily Mail, recruited his son Ian Sperling, who was Ian's stepfather, and Wilson to carry out the deception. Wilson was chosen as the photographer because his professional credentials would lend the image credibility. The photograph was submitted, published, and became an instant sensation. Wetherell never publicly revealed the hoax, and Wilson maintained his silence until his death in 1969. Sperling's 1994 confession was corroborated by additional research, including analysis of the photograph itself and interviews with surviving family members. The Daily Mail had been fooled again, or perhaps had not looked too closely at a story that sold newspapers. The revelation that the most famous piece of evidence for the Loch Ness Monster was a deliberate fabrication should have been fatal to the legend. In rational terms, it should have ended the story. The hoax was public, documented, and admitted by the participants. And yet the sightings did not stop. In the decades that followed the surgeon's photo hoax, hundreds of people continued to report encounters with something in Loch Ness. Some were undoubtedly influenced by the existing legend, interpreting ambiguous stimuli through the lens of expectation, but others were more difficult to dismiss. Experienced sailors, sonar operators, scientists, and skeptics, who claimed to have seen or detected something they could not explain. Why did the legend persist even after its most iconic image was exposed as a fraud? Part of the answer lies in the nature of the loch itself. Loch Ness is not a small pond or a shallow bay, where every square meter can be easily surveyed. It is a vast, deep, opaque body of water, with conditions that make comprehensive observation nearly impossible. Visibility is measured in feet, not yards. The water temperature remains cold enough year-round, ranging from 40 to 54 degrees Fahrenheit. That thermal currents and density layers create complex acoustic environments that interfere with sonar. The loch's narrow shape and steep sides mean that sound waves can reflect and refract in unpredictable ways, producing false echoes and phantom contacts. The surface is often disturbed by wind, boat wakes, and the movement of fish schools, particularly Arctic char, salmon, and eels, some of which can grow to substantial sizes. The loch's connection to the sea via the River Ness and the Caledonian Canal means that marine species occasionally enter, including seals, which have been spotted in the loch multiple times, and which, when swimming with only their heads above water, can create a profile remarkably similar to descriptions of the monster. All of these factors create an environment ripe for misidentification and ambiguity. A floating log, waterlogged and heavy, can rise and fall in a way that mimics the motion of a swimming animal. A wave pattern created by the interaction of wind, current, and the loch's bathymetry can produce a series of standing waves that appear to move independently of the surrounding water. A school of fish breaking the surface, a diving bird, a distant boat wake. All of these can, under the right conditions and from the right angle, look like something else. And once the idea of a monster is established, once the possibility exists in the observer's mind, the threshold for interpreting an ambiguous stimulus as confirmation of that possibility drops dramatically. This is not deception or stupidity. It is a well-documented cognitive phenomenon. We see what we expect to see, especially when we are primed to look for it. But expectation and misidentification do not account for everything. Throughout the mid to late 20th century, efforts to systematically search Loch Ness intensified, moving beyond anecdotal sightings and blurry photographs to organized scientific expeditions. In 1960, a Cambridge engineer named Tim Dinsdale filmed what he believed to be a large animate object moving through the water near Foyers. The footage, analyzed by the Royal Air Force's Joint Air Reconnaissance Intelligence Center, was judged to show probably an animate object, and was never conclusively debunked, though skeptics have suggested it may have been a boat. In the 1970s, Robert Rines, an American lawyer and inventor, conducted a series of expeditions using underwater cameras and sonar. Rines's team produced several intriguing sonar contacts and underwater photographs, including one image taken in 1972 that appeared to show a diamond-shaped flipper. The photograph was grainy and heavily enhanced, and subsequent analysis suggested it might be an artifact of photo processing or a misidentified tree stump. But it generated renewed scientific interest. In 1975, Rines's team published their findings in the journal Nature, arguing that the evidence warranted formal zoological investigation and proposing the creature be classified as Nessiteras rhombopteryx, a name that, whether intentionally or coincidentally, is an anagram of monster hoax by Sir Peter S. The most comprehensive search came in 1987, Operation Deepscan, funded by a combination of private donors and corporate sponsors, deployed a flotilla of 19 boats equipped with echo, sounding sonar across the entire width of the loch. The boats moved in a coordinated sweep from one end of the loch to the other, using overlapping sonar beams to scan the water column from surface to bottom. The goal was to create a sonar curtain, a moving wall of sound that would detect any large object in the water. Over the course of a week in October 1987, the operation covered the entire loch. The sonar detected 3 contacts that could not be easily explained. Large mobile objects in deep water that appeared and then disappeared, leaving no trace. The contacts were described as stronger than a shoal of fish but weaker than a sunken boat. And they moved in ways inconsistent with debris or known wildlife. The operation's lead sonar expert, Darrell Lawrence, stated that the contacts were probably animate, but could not be identified. No definitive evidence was obtained. No photographs, no tissue samples, no physical proof, but the sonar contacts recorded on equipment used for marine research and naval operations suggested that something large and mobile was present in the loch. Since Operation Deepscan, technology has advanced dramatically. High-resolution sonar, underwater remotely operated vehicles, ROV's environmental DNA sampling, and drone surveillance have all been deployed in and around Loch Ness. In 2018, a team from the University of Otago in New Zealand conducted a comprehensive environmental DNA study, collecting water samples from multiple locations and depths and sequencing all detectable genetic material. The study found DNA from a wide range of species, including deer, sheep, cattle, humans, and numerous fish and bird species. Notably, the study detected an unusually high quantity of eel DNA, leading the researchers to suggest that reports of large creatures in the loch might be explained by exceptionally large European eels, which can grow to 6 feet or more in length under ideal conditions. The study did not find DNA from any large unknown species, or from plesiosaurs, ruling out the possibility of a population of surviving prehistoric reptiles, at least in the samples analyzed. And yet the sightings continue. In 2019, a website that tracks and catalogues Loch Ness Monster reports recorded 18 separate sightings, the highest annual total in years. Many of these were from tourists. Some were from drone operators, who claimed to have captured unidentified shapes in aerial footage. And a few were from local residents who had lived on the loch for decades, and who insisted that what they saw could not be explained by known animals or objects. The official Loch Ness Monster register, maintained by Gary Campbell, a former accountant from River Ness, who has been documenting sightings since 1996, lists over 1,000 recorded encounters, ranging from brief glimpses of something moving in the water to detailed multi-witness accounts of large, animate creatures displaying behavior inconsistent with any known species in the loch. The geography of Loch Ness is central to understanding why the legend persists and why comprehensive debunking remains elusive. The loch is long and narrow, roughly the shape of a sword blade laid along the Great Glen. Its maximum depth of 755 feet is greater than the height of a 60-story building. The volume of water it contains, approximately 263 billion cubic feet, is staggering. To put that in perspective, if you drained Loch Ness and refilled it, using the combined flow of all the rivers in England and Wales, it would take more than a year. The water is not clear. Peat runoff from the surrounding hills stains it dark brown, and silt suspended in the water column reduces visibility to less than 30 feet under most conditions, and often less than 10. Underwater, even with powerful lights, a diver can see only a short distance in any direction before the water fades to black. The loch's steep sides mean that the bottom is a series of slopes, shelves, and drop-offs, with deep basins separated by underwater ridges. There are places along the loch's floor where sediment has accumulated to depths of 40 feet or more, soft, organic muck into which objects, including large objects, can sink and be buried. These conditions create numerous hiding places. A large animal, or a population of large animals, could occupy the loch without being easily detected, particularly if they were bottom dwellers or spent most of their time in deep water. Sonar can detect objects, but interpretation requires expertise, and the loch's complex acoustic environment generates noise and interference. Surface observation is limited by visibility, weather, and the sheer size of the area to be monitored. Even in the age of satellite imagery and drones, there are long stretches of time when no one is watching, when the loch is empty of boats, when the skies are clouded, and when the surface is hidden by fog. If something large and intelligent, or even large and instinctively cautious, lived in Loch Ness, it would have ample opportunity to avoid detection. The possibility that the loch could conceal an unknown species is not in itself absurd. The deep oceans are still poorly explored, and new species of large marine animals, including whales and sharks, have been discovered within the past century. Freshwater environments are generally more thoroughly studied, but even in well-known rivers and lakes, surprises occur. In 2020, a previously unknown species of river dolphin was identified in the Amazon basin, a region that has been inhabited and studied for centuries. Cryptozoology, the search for animals whose existence is not scientifically confirmed, has a mixed reputation, associated more often with hoaxes and wishful thinking than with genuine discovery. But the underlying principle is sound. Absence of evidence is not evidence of absence, particularly in environments that are difficult to survey. The question, then, is not whether Loch Ness could support an unknown species, but whether the evidence suggests it does. And the answer, at present, is no. No physical remains have been found, no bones, no teeth, no definitive photographs or video footage exists. The sonar contacts are intriguing but inconclusive. The eyewitness accounts are numerous but variable, and many can be explained by known phenomena. The environmental DNA study found no trace of an unknown large animal, though critics have pointed out that EDNA sampling is not infallible and that a small, elusive population might be missed, especially if the animals were bottom dwellers. In an environment with high levels of background genetic material, what remains, then, is ambiguity. The Loch Ness Monster exists in the space between evidence and proof, between possibility and probability. It is sustained not by what has been found, but by what has not been ruled out. The loch is too large, too deep, too dark to be fully known. Every unexplained sonar contact, every ambiguous photograph, every sincere witness who insists they saw something keeps the legend alive. And the hoaxes, paradoxically, reinforce it. Each debunking removes a false piece of evidence, but it does not address the residual cases, the sightings and data points that do not fit neatly into the categories of misidentification or deliberate fraud. In popular imagination, the Loch Ness Monster has taken on a specific form, one that owes more to paleontology and Victorian adventure fiction than to Scottish folklore. The creature is almost universally depicted as a plesiosaur, a long-necked marine reptile that thrived during the Mesozoic era, from roughly 200 million to 66 million years ago, and that is presumed to have gone extinct along with the dinosaurs at the end of the Cretaceous period. Plesiosaurs were not dinosaurs. They were a distinct group of reptiles adapted for life in marine environments, with barrel-shaped bodies, 4 large flippers used for underwater flight, and long flexible necks tipped with relatively small heads armed with sharp teeth. Fossil evidence indicates that plesiosaurs were widespread and diverse, inhabiting oceans around the world. Their extinction is well documented in the fossil record. There are no known plesiosaur fossils from the Cenozoic era, the period following the extinction event that wiped out the non-avian dinosaurs and most large marine reptiles. For a plesiosaur to have survived in Loch Ness, it would require not only that a population of these animals evaded extinction 66 million years ago, but that they persisted, undetected, through the ice ages, through the formation and filling of the loch 12,000 years ago, and through the entire span of recorded human history. The biological implausibility of this scenario is difficult to overstate. A breeding population of large animals requires a minimum number of individuals to remain genetically viable over time. Estimates for large vertebrates typically range from several dozen to several hundred individuals. Such a population would require a substantial food supply. Plesiosaurs were carnivores, and maintaining a population of apex predators in a freshwater loch with limited biodiversity would be ecologically challenging. Loch Ness does contain fish, primarily Arctic char, salmon, trout, and eels. But the biomass is not comparable to that of the open ocean where plesiosaurs originally lived. The cold water temperature would also pose challenges. Plesiosaurs, like modern reptiles, were likely ectothermic, relying on external temperatures to regulate their body heat. The cold, stable temperature of Loch Ness, around 40 to 54 degrees Fahrenheit, would be far from ideal for an ectothermic reptile. Additionally, plesiosaurs were air breathers, adapted for life in marine environments, where surfacing to breathe was unproblematic. A population of large air-breathing animals in a relatively small, heavily watched loch would be expected to surface regularly and visibly. Despite these objections, the plesiosaur hypothesis remains the dominant interpretation of the Loch Ness Monster in popular culture, due in large part to the visual appeal of the concept and the influence of the surgeon's photo, which, though fake, established the long-necked, small-headed profile as the canonical image of the creature. But earlier descriptions, particularly those from the 1930s, before the plesiosaur idea became fixed, were often more varied and more ambiguous. Some witnesses described creatures with features inconsistent with plesiosaurs, multiple humps rising and falling independently, lack of visible flippers, speed and agility in the water that seemed implausible for a large, bulky reptile. A few descriptions suggested something serpentine, more eel-like or snake-like than reptilian. Others described creatures with seal-like heads or fish-like bodies. The diversity of these accounts suggests either multiple different stimuli being misinterpreted through the same legendary framework, or a collective uncertainty about what was actually being seen. There is another, older interpretation, rooted in the indigenous folklore of the Highlands, that predates the plesiosaur hypothesis by centuries. This is the tradition of the Kelpie and the Wisgi water spirits that could take the form of horses or other animals, and that inhabited lochs, rivers, and coastal waters. These beings were not animals in the biological sense. They were supernatural entities, dangerous and unpredictable. A Kelpie could appear as a beautiful horse grazing near the water's edge, inviting an unwary traveler to mount it, at which point the creature would plunge into the water, drowning its victim, and each was even more malevolent, said to tear its victims apart and devour them, leaving only the liver, which would float to the surface. These creatures were shape-shifters, capable of appearing in human form as well, and they were associated with specific bodies of water, often those that were deep, cold, and prone to claiming lives through drowning or hypothermia. The connection between the modern Loch Ness Monster and these older water spirit traditions is rarely acknowledged in popular accounts, but it is significant. The Uisge of Highland folklore was not a relic dinosaur. It was something else entirely, something that existed at the intersection of the natural and supernatural worlds, a manifestation of the loch's danger and mystery. When Mrs. Aldy Mackay reported her sighting in 1933, she was drawing on a long tradition of stories about things in the water, stories that her grandparents and great-grandparents would have known. Even if the specific term Loch Ness Monster was new, the substitution of a plesiosaur for a shape-shifting waterhorse reflects a broader shift in how we understand the unknown, from a spiritual and mythological framework to a scientific and zoological one. The monster became a zoological problem, something to be studied, catalogued, and either confirmed or debunked, rather than a numinous presence, something to be respected and feared. This shift was accelerated by the involvement of outsiders, journalists, scientists, adventurers, who came to Loch Ness in search of a story or a discovery, and who brought with them assumptions and frameworks that did not necessarily align with local traditions. The transformation of the Loch Ness Monster from a nebulous folkloric entity into a specific, identifiable creature began almost immediately after the 1933 sightings. One of the earliest and most influential voices in this transformation was Rupert T. Gould, a retired Royal Navy officer and expert in horology and natural history. In 1934, Gould published The Loch Ness Monster and Others, a book that compiled eyewitness accounts and attempted to analyze them systematically. Gould was a careful researcher, and he approached the subject with a degree of skepticism. But he also took the reports seriously and argued that they described a real biological creature. His book was widely read and helped establish the parameters of the modern legend, the idea that the monster was a large aquatic animal, possibly a surviving prehistoric species, and that the sightings were genuine encounters with an unknown species, rather than folklore or hallucination. Gould's work was followed by others. In the 1950s and 1960s, naturalists, zoologists, and cryptozoologists began visiting Loch Ness in increasing numbers. Some, like Tim Dinsdale, devoted years of their lives to the search. The involvement of credentialed scientists, including biologists and sonar experts, lent legitimacy to the hunt, even as many in the scientific establishment dismissed it as a waste of time. The Academy of Applied Science, a Boston-based research organization, sponsored several expeditions to Loch Ness in the 1970s and 1980s, bringing sophisticated equipment and academic rigor to the search. These expeditions did not produce conclusive proof, but they did produce data, sonar contacts, underwater photographs, and detailed bathymetric surveys that kept the question open. The internationalization of the Loch Ness Monster legend also brought commercialization. By the 1960s, the creature had become a tourist attraction, a marketing tool for the Highlands. Hotels, gift shops, and tour operators built their businesses around the monster. The village of Drumnadrochit, where Mrs. Mackay first reported her sighting, became the epicenter of monster tourism, home to two competing Loch Ness Monster exhibitions. Visitors could take boat tours, buy souvenir plesiosaurs, and hear the latest sighting reports. The Scottish Tourist Board promoted the monster as a whimsical, family-friendly attraction, a symbol of Scotland's wild places and enduring mysteries. The creature appeared on postcards, in advertisements, and eventually in film and television, where it was alternately portrayed as a terrifying beast, a misunderstood gentle giant, or a comedic figure. This commercialization had a paradoxical effect. On one hand, it trivialized the legend, reducing a complex, culturally rooted story to a marketing gimmick and a punchline. On the other hand, it kept the legend alive. The economic incentive to maintain interest in the monster meant that new sightings were reported and publicized, that researchers continued to visit the loch, and that the question of the creature's existence remained a topic of public conversation. The monster became self-sustaining, a perpetual motion machine of media attention, tourism revenue, and speculation. The documented cases, the specific incidents that have been recorded, investigated, and preserved in archives, newspapers, and research reports, form the empirical core of the Loch Ness Monster legend. These cases vary widely in credibility, specificity, and evidential value, but they provide a historical record of what people have reported seeing and experiencing over the past 90 years, zone of the earliest and most detailed accounts. Beyond Mrs. Mackay's sighting comes from August 1933. On the 15th of August of that year, a couple named Mr. and Mrs. George Spicer were driving along the A82 road near Dawes, on the eastern shore of the loch. According to their testimony, which they reported to the Inverness Courier shortly after the incident, they saw a large dark creature cross the road approximately 50 yards ahead of their car. The creature, they said, had a long, undulating neck, a bulky body, and moved with a lurching, ungainly gait. It was carrying something in its mouth, which Mrs. Spicer described as resembling a small animal, or perhaps a large fish. The creature crossed the road and disappeared into the undergrowth on the loch side of the road before the Spicers could get a closer look. The couple was adamant about what they had seen, and their account was widely reported. It was one of the first land sightings of the creature, and it added a new and unsettling dimension to the legend. The idea that the monster was not confined to the water, but could and did come ashore. The Spicers' account was met with a mixture of belief, skepticism, and ridicule. Some locals suggested they had seen a deer or a large otter, though the Spicers insisted that what they saw was far larger and moved in a way inconsistent with any terrestrial animal they knew. The sighting was investigated by several researchers over the years, and no conclusive explanation was ever produced. The Spicers maintained their story for the rest of their lives. Another significant case occurred in May 1943, during the Second World War. C.B. Farrell, a member of the Royal Observer Corps, was on duty at a lookout post near Loch Ness when he saw what he described as a large dark object moving through the water approximately 200 yards offshore. Farrell was equipped with binoculars and had a clear view. He described the creature as having a long neck, a small head, and a large humped body. He watched it for several minutes before it submerged. Farrell's account is notable because it came from a trained observer whose job required accurate identification and reporting of objects at a distance. His sighting was recorded in official logs and later included in compilations of Loch Ness Monster reports. In October 1954, a fishing boat named Rival III, captained by a man named K. MacDonald, was trawling for salmon near Urquhart Bay, a large, deep inlet on the western shore of the loch. The boat's sonar detected a large object moving beneath the vessel at a depth of approximately 480 feet. The object appeared on the sonar screen as a solid return, consistent with a large, dense mass, and it moved at a speed estimated at several knots. The crew attempted to track the object, but it descended further and disappeared off their sonar. The incident was reported to the press and became one of the first sonar contacts associated with the Loch Ness Monster. Skeptics suggested the sonar might have detected a large fish, a school of fish, or a submerged log, but the crew insisted that the return was inconsistent with any of those explanations. One of the most compelling modern cases occurred in May 2007. A laboratory technician named Gordon Holmes, who had been visiting the loch as an amateur researcher, recorded a video showing a dark, elongated shape moving rapidly through the water near Urquhart Castle. The footage, which runs for several minutes, shows a distinct object creating a visible wake as it moves parallel to the shore. The object is dark, appears to undulate, and moves at a speed inconsistent with surface debris or a wake from a distant boat. Holmes submitted the footage to marine biologists for analysis. Dr. Adrian Shine, a researcher with the Loch Ness Project, examined the video and stated that it showed some animal, though he could not identify the species. Others suggested it might be an otter, a seal, or a large eel, but the size and speed of the object, as well as the distance from shore, made these explanations uncertain. The video was broadcast on international news and remains one of the most widely viewed pieces of modern Loch Ness Monster evidence. In August 2009, another sonar contact was recorded, this time by a boat operator named Marcus Atkinson. Atkinson was conducting a tourist cruise on the loch when his boat's sonar detected a large moving object at a depth of approximately 75 feet. The sonar return showed an object roughly 5 feet wide and moving steadily beneath the boat. Atkinson, who had worked on the loch for years, and was familiar with sonar readings of fish, logs, and other common objects, stated that the return was unlike anything he had seen before. The contact lasted for several minutes before the object descended and disappeared. The incident was reported to the official Loch Ness Monster Register and was included in the sighting log for that year. Not all documented cases are ambiguous or unexplained. In several instances, sightings that were initially reported as monster encounters were later identified as known animals or objects. In 2016, a widely circulated photograph taken by a tourist near Fort Augustus appeared to show a large dark shape in the water. The image was analyzed by researchers who determined that it showed a catfish, a species that had been introduced to the loch in the 1980s and had grown to substantial size. In another case, a video recorded in 2018 showing a long dark object moving through the water was later identified as a large floating log, partially submerged, being pushed by wind and current. These debunkings are important because they illustrate both the challenges of interpreting ambiguous visual data and the willingness of researchers to correct errors. When identifications can be made, the cumulative effect of these documented cases is a picture of persistent, ongoing reports of large, unidentified objects in Loch Ness, interspersed with instances where explanations can be found. The pattern suggests that most sightings are likely misidentifications, optical illusions, or hoaxes, but that a small residue of cases remains difficult to explain using conventional means. This residue is what keeps the legend alive and what motivates continued research and investigation. The Loch Ness Monster's transformation into a global pop culture phenomenon began in the 1930s, but accelerated dramatically in the second half of the 20th century. The creature has appeared in hundreds of books, films, television shows, comic books, video games, and advertisements, each iteration shaping and reshaping public perception of what the monster is and what it represents. One of the earliest fictional treatments was the 1961 film Gorgo, a British science fiction monster movie produced in the wake of Japan's Godzilla films. While Gorgo itself was not set at Loch Ness, it drew explicitly on the Loch Ness Monster legend and the broader cultural fascination with unknown aquatic creatures. The film's monster is captured from the waters off Ireland and brought to London for exhibition, echoing themes of exploitation and the consequences of disturbing ancient hidden life. The film was a modest commercial success and contributed to the growing association between cryptids, particularly aquatic ones, and the emerging genre of feature cinema. More direct treatment came in 1969 with the release of the Loch Ness Horror, a low-budget British horror film that presented the monster as a prehistoric creature awakened by underwater explosions. The film was poorly received and is now largely forgotten, but it established several tropes that would recur in later depictions. The idea of the monster as a territorial, aggressive predator, the involvement of scientists who initially doubt the creature's existence, but are forced to confront it, and the tragic destruction of the creature at the hands of fearful humans. These themes reflected broader anxieties of the 1960s and 1970s, particularly concerns about environmental destruction and humanity's relationship with the natural world. The 1970s saw the Loch Ness Monster enter children's media. The 1975 novel The Waterhorse by Dick King Smith, latter adapted into a 2007 film, reimagined the creature as a gentle, magical being. A waterhorse in the folkloric sense that forms a bond with a young boy. This version of the monster was explicitly non-threatening, a misunderstood outcast rather than a predator. The book was widely read and helped cement the Loch Ness Monster's place in children's literature as a figure of wonder rather than fear. The 2007 film adaptation, released as The Waterhorse, Legend of the Deep, updated the setting to World War II and emphasized themes of courage, friendship, and environmental stewardship. The film was a commercial success and introduced the legend to a new generation of viewers, many of whom encountered the Loch Ness Monster first through this sympathetic portrayal rather than through cryptozoological or horror contexts. In 1981, the monster appeared in the film The Private Eyes, a comedy starring Tim Conway and Don Knotts. The film treated the creature as a source of humor rather than horror, part of a broader trend in the 1980s toward comedic or parodic treatments of cryptids and supernatural entities. This lighter approach reflected a shift in public perception. By the 1980s, the Loch Ness Monster had become familiar, almost domesticated, a staple of popular culture that could be invoked for laughs as easily as for scares. The 1990s and 2000s saw the Loch Ness Monster appear in video games, including Tomb Raider III 1998, where the creature serves as a boss enemy in a level set in Scotland. The game's depiction of the monster as a large, aggressive plesiosaur reinforced the canonical visual image, established by the surgeon's photo and decades of speculative illustration. The creature also appeared in numerous children's television programs, including episodes of Scooby, where it was inevitably revealed to be a hoax or a misunderstood animal, and The Simpsons, where it was parodied as part of the show's recurring theme of debunking myths and exposing scams. In literature, the Loch Ness Monster has been featured in novels ranging from thrillers to romances. Steve Alten's 2001 novel, The Loch, presented the creature as the last survivor of a prehistoric species, discovered by a disgraced marine biologist seeking redemption. The novel was a bestseller and combined cryptozoological speculation with action, adventure plotting, appealing to readers interested in both the science and the spectacle of monster hunting. The book's depiction of the Loch as a dangerous, isolated environment and the monster as a tragic relic of a lost world reflected ongoing themes in cryptozoological fiction: the tension between discovery and exploitation, the ethical questions surrounding the treatment of unknown species, and the melancholy of extinction. More recently, the Loch Ness Monster has appeared in video games like Assassin's Creed Valhalla 2020, where it is depicted as part of the game's exploration of Norse mythology and British folklore, and in mobile games, augmented reality applications, and virtual reality experiences. These digital incarnations allow users to encounter the monster in simulated environments, blurring the line between legend and entertainment. Across all these depictions, several patterns emerge. First, the physical appearance of the Loch Ness Monster has become standardized, almost always depicted as a plesiosaur or plesiosaur-like creature, regardless of the diversity of original witness descriptions. This standardization reflects the power of the surgeon's photo and early illustrations to define the creature's canonical form. Second, the monster has been progressively softened and sanitized, particularly in children's media, transforming from a potentially dangerous unknown entity into a friendly, misunderstood character. This shift mirrors broader trends in how Western culture represents wildlife and the natural world, a move from viewing nature as something to be feared and conquered to viewing it as something to be protected and cherished, even when that nature is fictional or speculative. Third, the creature has become detached from its original cultural and geographical context. In many modern depictions, the Loch Ness Monster is a generic lake monster or sea monster, stripped of its specific connection to Highland folklore, Scottish history, and the unique geography of Loch Ness. It exists as a free-floating signifier, a name and an image that can be dropped into any narrative framework without requiring deeper engagement with its origins. This transformation reflects a broader pattern in the commodification and globalization of folklore. Legends that originate in specific cultural contexts are extracted, simplified, and repackaged for mass consumption, often losing much of their original meaning in the process. The Loch Ness Monster is no longer primarily a story about the dangers of deep water, the limits of human knowledge, or the persistence of the numinous in a disenchanted world. It is a brand, a tourist attraction, a pop culture icon. This is not unique to the Loch Ness Monster. Similar processes have affected countless other legends, from vampires to werewolves to dragons. But the speed and extent of the transformation in this case is striking. In less than a century, the creature went from a locally rooted tradition to a global phenomenon, recognized by people who have never been to Scotland, and who may not even know where Loch Ness is. The question that lingers, the question that persists despite debunkings and failed expeditions and environmental DNA studies that find nothing, is why? Why does the legend endure? What need does it fulfill? Part of the answer lies in the nature of the loch itself. Loch Ness is a place that resists full comprehension. It is too deep, too dark, too vast. We can map its surface, we can send sonar and submersibles into its depths, but we cannot see it, not really. There are places in Loch Ness that have never been observed by human eyes. Places where the water is so deep and so cold that nothing from the surface world penetrates. These are not metaphorical spaces. They are real, physical locations. Regions of our planet that remain as unknown and inaccessible as the surface of Mars. The existence of such places, the knowledge that there are depths we cannot plumb. The Loch Ness Monster inhabits that space, not as a biological organism that can be captured and catalogued, but as a symbol of all that remains beyond our reach. The legend also speaks to a deeper longing, a desire for the world to be stranger and more wondrous than the evidence suggests. We live in an age of unprecedented scientific knowledge, an age in which the mechanisms of life, the structure of matter, and the history of the cosmos have been revealed in extraordinary detail. And yet, or perhaps because of this, there is a yearning for mystery, for the possibility that not everything has been explained, that there are still corners of the world where the rules are different, where the impossible might be real. The Loch Ness Monster offers that possibility. It is a small act of resistance against the totality of empirical knowledge, a refusal to accept that the world has been fully known and fully mapped. There is also, undeniably, an element of nostalgia. The Loch Ness Monster is a relic of a particular moment in the 20th century, a moment when the boundaries between the known and the unknown seemed more permeable, when exploration and discovery were still framed in terms of venturing into uncharted territory rather than analyzing datasets. The hunt for the monster evokes an earlier mode of adventure, one rooted in physical travel, direct observation, and the romance of the quest. In an age of digital surveillance and satellite imagery, when privacy is scarce and mystery is increasingly rare, the idea of a creature that has evaded detection for nearly a century is deeply appealing. But perhaps the most compelling reason the legend endures is simpler. The loch is still there. It has not been drained, it has not been conquered, and it has not given up all its secrets. The water is still black, still cold, still deep. People still stand on its shores and look out across that flat, dark surface and wonder what lies beneath. And sometimes, just sometimes, they see something, a ripple, a shadow, a shape that shouldn't be there, and for a moment, the possibility is real again. The Loch Ness Monster is not, in the end, about proof or evidence or scientific certainty. It is about the space between what we know and what we imagine, the gap between the world as it is and the world as we wish it could be. It is about standing at the edge of something vast and unknowable and feeling the pull of the depths. It is about the fact that there are still questions we cannot answer, still places we cannot see, still mysteries that resist resolution. And as long as the loch remains, as long as the water stays dark and deep and cold, the legend will remain with it, waiting in the silence below, neither confirmed nor denied, neither dead nor alive, but endlessly, tantalizingly present in the space where the known ends and the unknown begins. If you enjoyed this, hit like and subscribe for more folklore, myths, and mysterious creatures. See you next time.